Margot Sinclair had lived the same life for 32 years. Wake at 7, coffee at 7:15. The morning newspaper while Robert read the financial section. Breakfast together. Lunch alone. Dinner together, television, bed at 11, Sunday mass, Wednesday book club. The rhythms of a life so established that change seemed not just unlikely but impossible, a violation of the natural order. Robert died on a Tuesday morning in March. 6:43 a.m. to be exact. Margot remembered the time because she'd looked at the clock radio when his breathing changed. That sudden, unexpected silence. She'd pressed the emergency button, but she already knew. 32 years of marriage, and she recognized death the moment it arrived. The heart attack was massive. The hospital staff told her he wouldn't have suffered. Margot didn't believe them. She believed he had suffered. She believed he was still suffering, somewhere in the spaces between life and death, calling to her. The funeral was a Wednesday. The church was full. Colleagues from Robert's accounting firm, neighbors, distant cousins, friends from the golf club. They all said the same things. He was a good man, a kind man, a generous man. Margot smiled and accepted their condolences and felt nothing but a vast, echoing emptiness where her husband used to be. Her mother Margaret arrived the day after the funeral. Margaret was 78 years old, her body thin and angular, her mind sharp as broken glass. She had raised Margot alone after Margot's father died when Margot was 7. She had worked 2 jobs. She had sacrificed everything, and now she looked at her daughter, widowed at 63, and saw only weakness. "You can't stay in this house," Margaret said, sitting in the kitchen 3 weeks after Robert's death. The morning light came through the windows and made everything seem flat, two-dimensional. Every room is full of him. Every corner, every cupboard, every light switch. "He'll go mad." Margot looked at her mother. She was holding a cup of tea, but her hands weren't shaking. Nothing shook Margaret. Not death, not grief, not the terrible weight of loss that Margot felt pressing down on her chest like a stone. "He's everywhere," Margot whispered. "Exactly," said Margaret, "and you need to leave him behind. You need to start fresh, find a new place, build a new life." Margaret was right, of course. Margaret was almost always right. That was one of the things Margot had never forgiven her for. The house sold in 3 weeks. A young family with 2 children bought it. They seemed happy. They didn't know about the scratch on the hardwood floor from when Robert moved the desk. They didn't know that the kitchen was where he had his first heart attack, a minor one years ago that they had both pretended never happened. They didn't know that the master bedroom was where Margot had spent the last 3 nights after his death, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but stare at the ceiling and wonder how a person continued living when the other half of them was gone. The real estate agent's name was Dave Morrison. He wore suits that were too shiny and smiled too much. He showed Margot apartments, condominiums, 1-story homes in developments with names like Riverside Gardens and Peaceful Pines. They all looked the same, generic, soulless, like stage sets waiting for actors who would never arrive. Then Dave drove her to Riverside Drive on a Thursday afternoon in late April. The street was lined with old oak trees. The houses were large, set back from the road, with deep yards and the kind of permanent quality that suggested they would stand forever. One house in particular caught Margot's attention, a 3-story Victorian painted a soft gray, with white trim and tall windows that seemed to watch her approach. "This is 42 Riverside," said Dave, pulling into the driveway. "The seller is a widow like you. Lost her husband 5 years ago. She's moving to a retirement community. Wants something smaller, easier to manage. The house is in excellent condition. Original hardwood floors, updated plumbing and electrical. A beautiful basement with room for storage or a workshop. A widow, like you." As if grief was a category like a filing system, Margot suppressed the urge to tell Dave Morrison to go to hell. She walked through the front door. The entrance hall was large and airy, creme-colored walls, pale wood floors, a staircase curved upward into shadow. Everything was very clean, very organized, very empty. It smelled like the house of someone who was leaving everything behind. Dave showed her the living room, the dining room, the kitchen, which was surprisingly modern and beautiful with a window overlooking a garden, the upstairs bedrooms, and then finally, he showed her the second parlor. This was the previous owner's personal space, Dave said, opening double doors. She used it as a study. Very peaceful room, she said. Good light, very quiet. The room was indeed beautiful. Large windows overlooked the garden and the trees beyond. Built-in bookshelves lined the walls. There was a fireplace with a marble mantelpiece. And in the far corner, so small it seemed almost part of the wall, was a door. It was painted a dull yellow-orange color. The paint was cracked and peeling. It was clearly very old, much older than the rest of the house. And it was locked. Margot walked toward it without thinking. The door was no more than 4 feet tall, barely large enough for an adult to pass through. There was a keyhole, old and decorative, and a deadbolt below it. "What's this?" she asked. Dave glanced at it as if noticing it for the first time. "Oh, that? Yes, well, the previous owner mentioned something about it. I believe it leads to a storage closet or perhaps a small room that was no longer in use. The lock is quite old. If you're interested in the property, we can have it opened or simply have it refinished to match the rest of the room." Nothing to worry about, but Margot was worried. Or not worried. Something else. Curious. Drawn. She felt a pull toward that small yellow door, as if it contained something she desperately needed to know. "I'll take it," she said. "I'll take the house." The closing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. Margot spent those 2 weeks in her old house, surrounded by boxes, making decisions about what to keep and what to discard. Robert's clothes went to Goodwill. His personal papers went into filing boxes. His golf clubs went to his brother-in-law. But his books, his beloved collection of historical biographies and mysteries, those she packed carefully, knowing she would need them. They were part of him. They contained his underlined passages and marginal notes and the smell of his study. Moving day was gray and cold. 2 men came with a truck and carried boxes and furniture into the new house. Margot followed them from room to room, directing, organizing, trying to turn this empty shell into something that felt like home. By evening, the truck was empty and the men had left. Margot stood in the middle of the second parlor, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, and felt utterly alone. She made herself dinner, a simple salad and some bread, and ate it standing in the kitchen. The appliances were unfamiliar. The cupboards were in unexpected places. Even eating felt strange in this new house, like being a ghost in someone else's life. That night, Margot tried to sleep in the second-floor bedroom she had chosen as her own. The bed felt too big. The mattress was too firm. The darkness outside the windows was absolute. There were no streetlights on Riverside Drive, only the trees and the night. She lay awake for hours, listening to the house settle around her. Floors creaked. The heating system hummed and clicked. Pipes ran through the walls. Every sound was unfamiliar. Every sound seemed to carry meaning. At 3:47 a.m., Margot heard something else. It was a metallic sound. Soft, like a key turning in a lock, like a door opening. She sat up in bed, her heart suddenly racing. The sound came again. Tink, a small, precise sound. Metal on metal. Margot got out of bed. She pulled on her bathrobe and went to the window. Outside, the street was dark. The houses were dark. No cars, no people, nothing but the silent night. The sound came again. This time she was sure it was coming from downstairs. She went downstairs slowly, one hand on the banister. The darkness pressed in around her. She could see the shapes of furniture, the pale rectangles of windows. The house seemed to hold its breath. In the second parlor, she stopped. The small yellow door was open. Completely open. She was absolutely certain it had been closed when she went to bed. "Hello?" she called softly. Her voice sounded very small in the large room. "Is someone there?" No answer. But beyond the open door she could see something, a darkness deeper than the darkness of the house. And beyond that, a faint light as if from far away. She stepped toward the door. She could feel a coolness emanating from it, a kind of chill that made her skin prickle. With trembling fingers, she turned on her phone's flashlight and peered through the doorway. Stairs. Stone stairs spiraling downward into darkness. A basement. But not a basement like the ones she knew. This seemed to go down much deeper than the house should allow. The stone walls were old, rough, unfinished. The air that rose from below smelled of earth and something else, something sweet and rotten that made her stomach turn. "Hello?" she called again, and her voice echoed back to her from the depths. She stood at the threshold for a long moment, torn between terror and curiosity. Then a sound from upstairs, a door slamming, or was it just the house settling? Made her jump back. She shut the small yellow door firmly, The lock clicked shut with an almost audible sigh of relief. Margot went back upstairs and got into bed. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark listening, waiting for another sound, but nothing came. Silence pressed down on her like a blanket. When morning came, pale and gray through the bedroom windows, Margot went downstairs. The second parlor was as it had been when she first saw it. The small yellow door was closed. The lock was engaged. In the morning light, it seemed almost innocent, just an old door in an old house, nothing more. She called an electrician. "Any problems with the power?" the man asked, checking the circuit breaker in the basement. This basement, the normal basement reached by a regular staircase off the kitchen, was large and dry and completely mundane. It contained a furnace, a water heater, some shelving. "Nothing alarming, no," said Margot. I thought I heard something in the night. An electrical sound. Could be anything," said the electrician. "Old houses make noises. Expansion and contraction of the wood, pipes, settling. Nothing to worry about." But Margot was worried, and she was curious. That night at 3:47 a.m. she waited with a flashlight in the second parlor. The door remained closed. She waited until dawn, then went back to bed, unsure whether to feel relieved or disappointed. Over the following days, Margot explored the house more thoroughly. She opened every cupboard and closet. She examined every corner. In the second parlor, buried at the bottom of a cardboard box, she found a folder containing the house's documentation. Inside were construction plans, renovation records, and a brief history. Riverside, according to the papers, had been built in 1887 by a wealthy industrialist named William Hartford. The original structure had included a basement with specialized features. The wording was vague. In 1920, extensive renovations were made. In 1950, the basement door was sealed. Additional notes dated 1980 mentioned restoration and historical preservation efforts. After that, nothing. The records ended. A basement door sealed in 1950. Almost certainly the door to those spiral stairs. Margot went to the public library and began researching. She found old newspapers on microfilm. She looked up property records. She searched for information about William Hartford and the house's history. What she found was fragmentary, scattered, deliberately obscured, but gradually, a picture emerged. William Hartford had been a wealthy businessman in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He had owned textile mills, had invested in railroads, had been involved in various philanthropic ventures. He had married late in life, to a woman named Judith Ashford, who was 20 years his junior. Judith had been a schoolteacher. According to one newspaper article from 1920, she had relinquished her profession to devote herself to her household and charitable works. But there was something else. Margot found a death notice from 1923. Judith Hartford, aged 42, had died suddenly at home. Circumstances unknown, the notice said. Private funeral services. No details beyond that, and then, remarkably, William Hartford's name appeared in the news again in 1924. Married to a different woman, Ellen Ashford, Judith's sister. That same year, an article mentioned social welfare concerns and investigation into potential child endangerment at an address that was decidedly not 42 Riverside. The article was brief and vague. No names were given. But Margot, cross-referencing the dates and addresses, found another article, this one from 1925, that made her blood run cold. "Local tragedy brings attention to orphan care standards," the headline read. The article mentioned a basement, a locked door, and 12 children found in distressed condition. But again, no names. No specific details. Just a vague mention of legal concerns and discretion to protect the dignity of involved parties. 12 children. A locked door. A basement. That night Margot tried to sleep but couldn't. Her mind kept returning to the spiral stairs, to the ancient stone walls, to the sweet, rotten smell. At 3:47 a.m. she heard the sound again. The tink of a lock. The soft creak of a door opening. This time Margot didn't hesitate. She got out of bed, went downstairs, and approached the yellow door. It was open. The stairs descended into darkness. She took her flashlight, and before her courage could desert her, she went down. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling deeper and deeper into the earth. The air grew colder and damper with each step. Her flashlight beam caught glimpses of the rough stone walls, the irregular steps, the sense of great age and abandonment. Finally, the stairs ended in a large underground chamber. It was as big as the house above, with a low ceiling that created a sense of profound claustrophobia despite the size. And the walls. Every inch of wall space was covered with photographs. Margot's breath caught in her throat. There were hundreds of them. Thousands, perhaps. Sepia-toned, faded, but still visible. Faces, children's faces, boys and girls of various ages, from infants to teenagers. Some smiled at the camera. Some stared blankly. Some looked frightened. Some looked sick. And beneath each photograph was a date and a name. Eleanor Hartley. 1895, age 8, Thomas Ashford. 1901, age 5, Mary Whitmore. 1908, age 12, James Carmichael. 1910, age 7, Robert Sinclair. 1947, age 8, Margot's hands began to shake. Robert Sinclair. The name hit her like a physical blow. She shone her flashlight on the photograph. It was an old picture, sepia-toned, but unmistakably her late husband. Young Robert, 8 years old, pale, thin, with dark circles under his eyes. The same eyes she had loved for 32 years. At the far end of the chamber on the central wall hung a larger photograph than the others. A woman with long gray hair pulled back severely. Her face was gaunt, her eyes were hollow, and she stared at the camera with an expression of such profound despair that Margot had to look away. Beneath the photograph was written, Judith Hartford, teacher, 1923, the last day. And beside it, scratched into the wall in desperate, irregular handwriting, was a message. My babies, my God, my children, they came to me. They wanted me to save them. I locked the door. I locked the door and I locked it and I locked it. They cried and cried and I could not bear the crying, so I took the key and I threw it down the well, and I could not look at them anymore, so I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again there was only the silence, only the terrible silence. Only the dark and the cold and the knowledge that I had failed them all. Margot drove to her mother's apartment before dawn. It was a small place in a senior living community on the other side of town, the kind of place that smelled like institutional food and pine sol. Margaret answered the door in her bathrobe, her face showing surprise and then something else. Recognition, as if she had been waiting for this conversation for years. I know what happened at the house, Margot said, and Margaret's face went very pale. They sat in Margaret's small living room. Margaret made tea, though neither of them drank it. For a long time, Margaret didn't speak. Finally, she said, My mother was friends with William Hartford's first wife, Judith. They grew up together, I think. Or perhaps they worked together. I'm not entirely sure of the details anymore. My mother was always vague about it. But she told me years later, after I was grown and had children of my own. What happened in that house? Margaret paused, staring at her teacup as if it contained answers she couldn't find elsewhere. Judith Hartford was not a well woman, Margaret continued. That's what my mother called her. Not a well woman. But what she meant, I think, was that Judith was deeply, profoundly disturbed. She had lost children, her own children, to disease and accident. 4 or 5 of them, I believe. The exact number was never clear, and she couldn't bear it. She couldn't accept that children died. That people died. That loss was a permanent feature of existence. What did she do? Asked Margot, though she thought she already knew. She started collecting them, said Margaret quietly. Orphans. Street children. Children from the poorest parts of town. Children with no one to claim them. She told their families, or in most cases told the local authorities, that she was taking them in. Charitable work. Christian charity. She would give them food and shelter and teach them. That's what she said. But she locked them in the basement, said Margot. Margaret nodded slowly. She locked them in the basement. According to my mother, she told herself she was keeping them safe. Safe from disease. Safe from the contamination of the outside world. Safe from the chaos that had taken her own children. She fed them, or tried to. She taught them lessons. She read to them. But they never left that basement. They never saw sunlight. They never had fresh air. They died, said Margot. It wasn't a question. Yes, said Margaret. They died. Slowly. From neglect and disease and the sheer horror of being imprisoned underground. Some of them took months. Some of them took years. And Judith stayed down there with them, teaching, reading, gradually losing her mind until she couldn't tell the difference between trying to save them and killing them. And nobody stopped her? Asked Margot, her voice rising. Nobody knew? Nobody cared. It was 1923, said Margaret. Or 1924, or 1925. The timeline isn't entirely clear from my mother's stories. And Judith Hartford was rich and well-connected. Her husband was powerful. The authorities who might have interfered were swayed by money and influence. And the children, they were nobody's children. Orphans, the poor. Who cares about dead orphans? Who cares about dead poor children? Margaret's hands were shaking now, and Margot realized with a shock that her mother was afraid, deeply, profoundly afraid. Eventually, Margaret said, someone did find out. Perhaps a neighbor heard something. Perhaps a servant talked. The details are lost. But when the authorities finally broke into that basement, they found Judith dead. She had poisoned herself with laudanum, I believe. Or perhaps she simply lay down and refused to eat. They found the children. What was left of them? And the photographs? Asked Margot. Margaret's face went even paler. What photographs? Judith took photographs of all of them. Down in the basement. There are hundreds of them covering the walls. Margaret closed her eyes. I didn't know about photographs, she whispered. My mother didn't mention photographs. Why are there so many children? Asked Margot. The oldest photos are from 1895. The newest are from 1947. That's more than 50 years. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at her daughter. In that look, Margot saw something she had never seen before. Genuine, profound guilt. Because William Hartford built that basement for a reason, said Margaret slowly. He built it as a kind of sanctuary. A place where he believed he could preserve children. Keep them safe. When Judith died, he didn't destroy the basement. He didn't seal it off, not at first. And other people with similar obsessions, similar desires to control and preserve, they found their way to that house. They used that basement. They added their own collections, their own photographs, their own horror. That's insane, breathed Margot. Yes, said Margaret, it is. And finally, in 1950, someone, perhaps a new owner of the house, perhaps a neighbor with a conscience, sealed that door. Locked it, forbade anyone from going down there. But the photographs remained. The children remained, trapped forever. And Robert? Asked Margot. My Robert? Margaret looked away. Robert was William Hartford's grandson, she said quietly. Robert's father was William Hartford's son, a son that William had fathered with his second wife, Ellen. When Robert was 8 years old in 1947, his parents believed he was weak, sickly, prone to illness. So they took him to that house, to William Hartford's basement. They thought, they truly believed, that the treatment offered there would make him strong, make him healthy. Margot felt sick. She stood up and walked to the window, unable to look at her mother. My mother, Margaret continued, was a close friend of Robert's mother. She somehow found out what was happening. She went to the house. She demanded they release the boy. And they did. Perhaps because she was a woman of some standing in the community. Perhaps because they were afraid of exposure. But by that time, Robert had spent 6 weeks underground. 6 weeks in that basement. 6 weeks surrounded by dying children and a mad woman who believed she was saving them. Why didn't anyone stop her? Margot demanded, turning back to her mother. Why didn't anyone stop them? Because no one cared enough to make a fuss, said Margaret sadly. Or because they were afraid. Or because they didn't believe what they were hearing. And because in the end, Robert survived. He came out alive. That was enough. It wasn't enough, said Margot. It was never enough. Robert spent his entire life afraid. Did you know that? He had nightmares. Night terrors. He would wake up screaming. He couldn't sleep without the lights on. He was claustrophobic. He couldn't go into basements or closets or anywhere enclosed without starting to panic. I thought it was just his personality. I thought it was just how he was. I never knew. I know, said Margaret quietly. And I've lived with that guilt my entire life. I should have told you. I should have explained to you why he was the way he was. But I was ashamed. Ashamed of my own family's connection to it. Ashamed of my mother's friend who took him there. Ashamed that I had such a dark secret in my past. Margot sat back down. She felt hollowed out, as if everything inside her had been scooped away, leaving only an empty shell. What am I supposed to do with this information? She asked. I don't know, said Margaret. But I know that you've bought that house. I know you're living in that house. And I know that house is not finished with its story. That night, Margot didn't go back to 42 Riverside. She checked into a hotel and spent the night alone in a sterile room that smelled like bleach and anonymity. In the morning, she called a lawyer. "I need to understand the legal situation," she told him. "If there are human remains, skeletal remains, in the basement of my house, what are my obligations?" The lawyer made phone calls. There were conversations with the police department, the state medical examiner, the Historical Preservation Society. Slowly, a picture emerged. The house had been investigated in 1950, yes, but the investigation had been cursory and had concluded that there was no evidence of foul play, no bodies, no remains, nothing but photographs and some personal items. The photographs had been removed and likely destroyed. The basement had been sealed. The matter had been closed. "But the photographs are still there," Margot told the lawyer. "I've seen them." "That's not possible," said the lawyer. "The basement was sealed in 1950. It's been sealed for 70 years. "I've been down there," said Margot. "The stairs are still there. The photographs are still there." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Sinclair," said the lawyer carefully, "have you been sleeping well? Have you been under stress recently?" That night, Margot made a decision. She packed a bag and drove back to 42 Riverside. She would stay in the house. She would go into the basement. She would face whatever was there. At 3:47 a.m., she heard the tink of the lock. She got out of bed, went downstairs, and found the yellow door open. The stairs descended into darkness. She turned on every light in the second parlor, but the light didn't seem to penetrate beyond the door. It was as if the darkness was a physical thing, a barrier that light couldn't cross. Margot took a flashlight and went down. The basement was exactly as she had left it. The photographs covered every inch of wall. The woman's face, Judith Hartford's face, stared down from the central wall with its expression of bottomless despair. And now, as Margot stood in the center of the chamber, she heard something. Voices. At first they were very faint, as if coming from very far away. But gradually they grew louder. Children's voices, whispering, speaking, crying. "Eleanor," one voice said. "My name is Eleanor." "Thomas," said another. "Mary, James, and Robert," said a voice that was eerily, impossibly familiar. It was the voice of her late husband, but younger. Much younger. A child's voice. "My name is Robert Sinclair." Margot turned slowly in a circle, trying to locate the voices, but they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls themselves, from the darkness beyond the reach of her flashlight. "We can't leave," the voices said, speaking in unison now. "We're trapped." She locked the door. She threw away the key. "We can't leave." "I can help you," Margot said, and her voice sounded small and fragile against the weight of those phantom voices. "I can open the door. I can let you out." "She won't let us out," said the voices. "She's still here. She's always here. She guards the door. She guards us. She won't let us go." And then, from the shadows at the far end of the basement, a figure began to take shape. It was a woman. She was very tall, impossibly tall, taller than a woman should be. Her face was gray and featureless, like a photograph that had been exposed to light until all detail was bleached away. Her hands were long and skeletal, with fingers that seemed to stretch on forever. "You're not one of mine," the figure said, and its voice was Judith Hartford's voice, but distorted, echoing, as if speaking through layers and layers of stone and earth and time. "You don't belong here. Go away." "I'm Margot Sinclair," said Margot, forcing herself to stand firm even as every instinct screamed at her to run. "Robert's wife. I've come to let him out." "Robert belongs here," said Judith. "He always belonged here. He was weak. He was sick. I saved him. I saved all of them." "You didn't save them," said Margot. "You killed them. You kept them imprisoned and they died here, down in the dark, alone, afraid. That's not salvation. That's murder." The figure seemed to shrink, to collapse in on itself. The long fingers withdrew into the darkness. The featureless face began to show cracks like an old photograph splitting apart. "I was trying to save them," Judith's voice wailed. "I was trying to keep them safe. The world is so full of pain, so full of loss. I thought if I could just keep them here, keep them safe, nothing bad would ever happen to them again." "But everything bad happened to them," said Margot. "They died here. They're still trapped here, and you're trapped here too, all of you, caught in this moment, this terrible moment forever. I can't let them go," whimpered Judith. "If I let them go, I'm admitting what I did. I'm admitting that I failed. That I killed them. You already know what you did, said Margot, and you've been punished for it. You've been trapped here for more than 100 years. Isn't that enough? Don't they deserve to rest? Don't you deserve to rest? For a long moment there was only silence. Then the children's voices spoke again, but this time they were different. Calmer, less desperate. Let us go, they said. Please, we're so tired. We just want to sleep. Let them go, said Margot to the figure of Judith. The figure was fading now, becoming transparent, becoming less real. I'm sorry, she said in a voice so small it could barely be heard. I'm so sorry. For everything. For all of it. And then she was gone. The basement didn't change immediately. The photographs were still there. The walls were still stone. The air was still cold and damp. But something fundamental had shifted. The sense of desperate, trapped anguish that had permeated the space was gone. In its place was something else, a kind of peace. A kind of release. Margot climbed the stairs and returned to the second parlor. The yellow door swung closed behind her and she heard the lock click shut. She tried the handle, it was locked. But it didn't feel like a trap anymore. It felt like a boundary. A line between worlds. In the morning, Margot called a contractor. I want to seal the basement, she told him. Completely. Cement over the door. Fill in the stairs if you can reach them. I want that space to be inaccessible. That's going to be expensive, the contractor said. I don't care, said Margot. I want it sealed immediately. Today, if possible. By that evening, the yellow door was covered with wood paneling. Within a week, it had been completely sealed off. A new wall was constructed in the second parlor, hiding all evidence of the door's existence. The contractor found no basement stairs when he tried to access them from the main basement, just a wall of solid stone. He reported this as unusual but ultimately inconsequential. That night at 3:47 a.m., Margot heard no sounds at all. Margot spent another week in the house at 42 Riverside. She packed her belongings. She sold the furniture that had belonged to the previous owner. She put the house up for sale. Why are you selling? Asked her mother Margaret over the phone. You just bought it. It's not my house, said Margot simply. It never was. It belongs to something else. Something old. Something that has its own purposes. Did you find peace? Asked Margaret. Did you find what you were looking for? I found the truth, said Margot. I found out what happened to Robert. I found out why he was the way he was. I found out what your mother never told you. And I let them go. Let who go? The children, said Margot. All of the children trapped in that basement. Including Robert. I helped them find peace. There was a long silence. Then Margaret said, Thank you for doing that. For giving Robert, for giving all of them a chance to rest. You should have told me, said Margot. You should have told Robert. You should have told someone. I know, said Margaret. I've lived with that regret for 50 years. That's my punishment, I suppose. To know what I knew and to say nothing about it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know if I can, said Margot. But I can try. The house sold quickly to a young family with children, ironically. When Margot walked through the door for the last time, she felt no sadness, only relief. She had done what needed to be done. She had helped people who couldn't help themselves. She had broken a cycle of horror that had lasted more than a century. Margot found a new house on the other side of town. It was smaller, simpler, with no mysteries in its basement. It had large windows that looked out onto a garden filled with flowers. It had no locked doors, no hidden staircases, no secrets. At night, when Margot lay in bed, she sometimes thought of Robert. She thought of him as a young man, before the trauma, before the nightmares, before the weight of that underground prison had seeped into his very soul. She thought of the 8-year-old boy who had been taken to that terrible place. She thought of what he might have been if he hadn't spent those 6 weeks in darkness. But mostly she thought of the children. Eleanor and Thomas and Mary and James and all the others. She thought of them ascending, finally, into whatever peace awaited them in the next world. She imagined them running through green fields, laughing in the sunlight, free at last from the darkness that had held them for so long. Sometimes, on quiet nights, Margot would dream of them. In the dreams, they weren't tragic or frightened. They were just children playing, living the lives they should have lived, and Margot would wake with tears on her face, but they were tears of peace rather than sorrow. 6 months after Margot moved out of 42 Riverside, the news came through the grapevine. The young family who had bought the house, the Hendersons, were having it extensively renovated. During construction, the contractors had discovered something remarkable. Behind the sealed basement door that Margot had covered with paneling, there was nothing. No stairs, no passage, no secret room. Just a solid wall of stone that appeared to have been there for at least a century. Must have been a design flaw, the contractor said in the newspaper article. Old houses like that sometimes had structural issues. Someone probably sealed it off years ago to prevent problems. But the Henderson family decided to investigate further. They contacted the Historical Society. The Historical Society contacted the police. The police contacted people at the state level. And gradually, the story of 42 Riverside began to emerge again. Or rather, to re-emerge because it had never fully disappeared. It had simply been buried, hidden away like the children in the basement. Archivists found old photographs in the state archives, records, testimony from people long dead. Slowly, carefully, the historians pieced together what had happened. Judith Hartford, William Hartford, the 12 children. Or was it more than 12? The records were incomplete. Some children had no names recorded. Some had no photographs. Were there others? In other basements? In other houses? The story made national news. The Hartford Basement Horror, one outlet called it. A century of secrets, said another. Margot saw herself quoted in several articles, though she had never given an interview. Apparently, the real estate agent, Dave Morrison, had been contacted by journalists and had mentioned the previous owner who had seemed disturbed by the house. Margot did finally give an interview to a journalist named Sarah Chan, who seemed genuinely interested in the truth rather than just sensationalism. How did you know? Sarah asked. How did you know what was in that basement? I didn't know, said Margot carefully. I suspected. But more than that, I listened. The house wanted to tell its story. The children wanted to be remembered. Do you believe in ghosts? Asked Sarah. Margot considered the question. I believe in trauma, she said finally. I believe that terrible events leave marks on places. Echoes. Imprints that can be sensed by people who are open to sensing them. Whether you call that ghosts or something else is a matter of semantics. The interview was published in a major magazine. It was read by thousands of people. Some believed Margot. Some thought she was mentally disturbed. Some thought she was capitalizing on tragedy for attention. But the important thing was that the story of the children, the real story, not the sanitized version that had been buried in 1950, was now in the world. It couldn't be hidden anymore. After the Hartford basement became public knowledge, other investigations began. If such a thing had happened at one house, could it have happened elsewhere? The answer, unfortunately, was yes. Over the next year, authorities investigated similar cases in 3 other states. In each case, they found evidence of homes that had been used for similar purposes. Basements or underground rooms where children had been kept. Not all of the cases involved murder or deliberate cruelty. Some seemed to be driven by obsession rather than malice. But all of them shared a common thread: desperation. The desperate attempt to control something that could not be controlled. The desperate attempt to prevent loss by preventing life itself. Margot read about each discovery with a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. At least now people knew. At least now the children were remembered. At least now society was asking difficult questions about how such things could happen and how to prevent them in the future. But there was something else that troubled Margot. In one of the other cases, in a house in Connecticut, the investigators had found a photograph among the preserved materials. It showed a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Judith Hartford. The woman's name, according to the photograph, was Margaret Hartwell. The date on the photograph was 1950. Margot showed the photograph to her mother. Margaret stared at it for a long time without speaking. Finally, she said, "That was my mother's sister. My aunt. I only met her once when I was very young. My mother never spoke about her." "What happened to her?" asked Margot. "I don't know," said Margaret. "She was never mentioned again after I was about 5 or 6 years old. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist." Margot did research. She found that Margaret Hartwell had died in 1952 in a psychiatric facility in Connecticut. The official cause of death was listed as complications from untreated mental illness. But Margot wondered if there was more to the story. If perhaps Margaret Hartwell had seen something or done something that had been deemed too shameful to discuss. What if she knew? Margot asked her mother. What if she knew what was happening in those houses? What if she was complicit? Then that makes her responsible, said Margaret quietly. And it makes the choices I made, the silence I kept, even more understandable, if not forgivable. Shame is a powerful thing. It makes people silence themselves. It makes them hide. It makes them pretend that terrible things aren't happening. We need to stop doing that, said Margot. We need to speak up. About everything. Margaret nodded. Yes, she said. We do. A year after leaving 42 Riverside, Margot started volunteering at a local child advocacy center. She worked with social workers and investigators, helping to uncover cases of child abuse and neglect. She trained other volunteers to listen carefully to children's stories, to recognize the signs of trauma, to help connect children with resources and support. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes listening to children describe the horrors they had endured, Margot would find herself thinking of Eleanor and Thomas and Mary and James and all the other children in that basement. She would think of Robert as an 8-year-old boy, locked underground, surrounded by dying children and a woman who believed she was saving him. And she would feel a fresh wave of grief and anger, but mostly she felt purpose. For the first time since Robert's death, Margot felt like her life had meaning beyond simple existence. She was helping. She was making a difference. She was honoring the memory of the children who had been lost and forgotten. Margaret died 2 years after Margot moved into her new house. She was 80 years old. She left Margot a letter in her will. My dear daughter, the letter read, I have lived much of my life in silence and in shame. I should have spoken up. I should have demanded that something be done about what happened to Robert and to the other children. Instead, I kept quiet and tried to pretend that the darkness didn't exist. I hope that in your work you will be braver than I was. I hope that you will speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. I am sorry for not doing so myself. I love you. Margaret. Margot kept the letter on her bedside table. She read it often. 5 years after leaving 42 to Riverside on a clear spring night, Margot had a dream. Or perhaps it wasn't a dream. The line between waking and sleeping had always been blurred for Margot ever since that first night in the old house. In the dream, or vision, Margot found herself in a garden. It was the most beautiful garden she had ever seen. Flowers bloomed in every color imaginable. Trees heavy with fruit swayed gently in a warm breeze. There was a fountain in the center, with clear water that seemed to glow with an inner light. And everywhere, there were children. Dozens of them, hundreds. They were playing, laughing, running through the garden with the kind of unself-conscious joy that only children possess. They were healthy and whole and alive in a way that the photographs in the Hartford basement had suggested they would never be. As Margot stood at the edge of the garden watching, a young boy approached her. He was about 8 years old with dark hair and serious eyes. But when he smiled, Margot recognized him. It was Robert. Her Robert, or rather a version of Robert, the version he might have been if he had never been taken to that terrible basement. Thank you, Robert said. His voice was clear and young and free of the worry that had always characterized her husband's speech. You set us free. You told our story. You helped people understand what happened to us. I was glad to do it, said Margot. Because of you, other children won't suffer like we suffered, said Robert. Other children will be protected. Other children will be believed when they tell their stories. I'm not sure I've done enough, said Margot. I feel like I should do more. You've done what you could, said Robert. And that's enough. Let others carry the burden now. You've earned the right to rest. Other children approached Eleanor and Thomas and Mary and James and dozens of others. They surrounded Margot, and though they didn't touch her, she felt their presence like a warm blanket. Like forgiveness. Like peace. When Margot woke, she was crying. But they were happy tears. She understood in that moment that the children had finally found peace, that they were no longer trapped, that they had moved on to whatever came after this world. And somehow that understanding gave Margot peace as well. 42 Riverside still stands. The Henderson family still lives there. Over the years, they've made the house into something beautiful. They've updated the kitchen and bathrooms. They've refinished the hardwood floors. They've painted the walls in warm, welcoming colors. They've filled the rooms with laughter and light and the everyday joy of family life. The second parlor is now the children's playroom. Bright toys are scattered across the floor. Drawings are pinned to the walls. Sunlight streams through the windows, touching every corner of the room. There is no trace of the yellow door, no hint of the basement beyond. It's as if that darkness never existed, and perhaps in a way it doesn't anymore. Perhaps by speaking the truth, by refusing to let the story be hidden and forgotten. Margot and Sarah Chen and the historians and the police investigators and all the others who worked to uncover what happened. Perhaps they've finally put that darkness to rest. Sometimes, on quiet nights, Margot thinks about 42 Riverside. She thinks about the Henderson family living there, unaware of the house's history, unaware of the children who once suffered in its basement. She wonders if they ever feel anything strange. A cold spot, an inexplicable sadness, a sense of presence, but she suspects they don't. She suspects that the darkness once acknowledged and remembered has been transformed into light, that the children once honored and mourned have found peace, that the house once a place of horror and despair has become simply a house, a shelter, a home, a place where people live and love and grow. That is Margot's greatest hope. That is her final prayer for the children of the basement. On a summer morning, 10 years after finding the photographs in the Hartford basement, Margot received a letter from the State Historical Society. They were establishing a memorial to the children who had died in the various underground rooms and basements across the country. They wanted Margot to be on the board of directors. Margot accepted immediately. The memorial took 2 years to build. It was constructed in the state capitol, in a park overlooking the river. It was a simple structure, a stone wall with the names of all the known children carved into it. Eleanor Hartley, Thomas Ashford, Mary Whitmore, James Carmichael, and many others, including Robert Sinclair. At the dedication ceremony, Margot stood at the front of the gathered crowd. There were journalists and historians and descendants of the victims and advocates for children's rights. There were survivors of childhood abuse who had come to pay their respects. There were families of the dead. Margot spoke about the importance of remembrance. She spoke about the power of telling stories that have been silenced. She spoke about the responsibility that all of us have to protect children and to believe them when they speak up about abuse. These children, she said, looking at the stone wall with its hundreds of carved names, cannot speak anymore. But we can speak for them. We can tell their stories. We can remember them. We can make sure that their suffering was not in vain. We can use their tragedy to protect children today and in the future. After the ceremony, people came up to shake Margot's hand. Many of them were in tears. One woman, a social worker named Diana, told Margot that she had gone into her profession specifically because of reading about the Hartford basement case. "You inspired me," Diana said. "Your determination to uncover the truth, your refusal to let those children be forgotten, it made me want to dedicate my life to helping children in similar situations." Margot embraced the woman, and both of them cried. By the time Margot turned 75, she had become something of a minor celebrity in activist circles. She had been featured in documentaries about child protection. She had written articles and op-eds. She had spoken at universities and conferences. But more importantly, she had become a voice for the voiceless, an advocate for the unseen. She had also become an expert on the psychology of trauma. She had studied PTSD, complex trauma, intergenerational trauma. She had come to understand deeply what Robert had suffered and why he had been the way he was. And in that understanding, she had finally forgiven him for his nightmares, his fears, his emotional distance. More than that, she had forgiven herself for not knowing, for not understanding what he had been through. On a quiet Tuesday evening, in her small house with the large windows overlooking the flower garden, Margot was going through old files when she found a letter. It was from Robert. She had never seen it before. It had been filed away, apparently, after his death. "My dearest Margot," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I've gone to whatever comes after this life, and I'm hoping it's somewhere quiet, somewhere safe, somewhere without basements or locked doors or the sound of children crying. I never told you what happened to me when I was 8 years old. I never told you about the basement, about Judith Hartford, about the other children. I didn't tell you because I was ashamed. I was ashamed that I had been weak. I was ashamed that I had been afraid. I was ashamed that I had survived when so many others didn't. But now, at the end of my life, I want you to know that I'm at peace with it. Not because I've forgotten, I could never forget. But because I had you, because I had your love and your kindness and your patient acceptance of the broken person I was. You never demanded that I be other than I was. You simply loved me as I was, nightmares and all. After I'm gone, I hope you'll find peace too. I hope you'll forgive me for the way I was. I hope you'll forgive yourself for not being able to save me from my own demons. And I hope eventually you'll be able to move on and find joy in your life again. There's one more thing I want to tell you. In my will, I've left you a small box. It's hidden in the basement of the old house. I know you hate basements, and I'm sorry to send you there, but it's important. Inside the box, you'll find the key. The original key to the yellow door at 42 Riverside. I don't know how I came to have it, but I've carried it with me for my entire life. A reminder of where I came from and what I survived. I want you to have it. I want you to do with it what you think is right. I love you, Margot. I always have, even when I couldn't say it. Even when my fear prevented me from being the husband you deserved. I hope you know that. Forever yours, Robert. Margot sat for a long time, holding the letter, tears streaming down her face. Eventually, she made a decision. She drove to the old house one more time. The new owners had long since moved away. The house had changed hands several times, but it still stood solid and real on Riverside Drive. She knocked on the door and spoke to the current owners, an elderly couple named the Patels. She told them that her late husband had hidden something in their basement and asked permission to retrieve it. The Patels were kind. They led her down to the basement. Margot, after all these years, still felt a flutter of fear when she descended the stairs. But the basement was just a basement, ordinary, empty, harmless. No yellow doors. No spiral staircases. No photographs or ghosts or voices of children. Behind a loose brick near the foundation, exactly where Robert's letter had indicated, Margot found a small metal box. Inside was the key. It was old and tarnished, with an ornate head carved in the shape of a rose. It was exactly the right size to fit the keyhole on the yellow door, the door that no longer existed, that had been sealed and covered and deliberately destroyed. Margot held the key in her palm for a long moment. Then she asked the Patels if she could use their fireplace. They agreed without asking questions. In the fireplace of a house that had been filled with horror, Margot burned the key. She watched it turn black in the flames, watched it curl and crack and finally crumble to ash. And with it she burned away the last physical connection to that terrible place. Rest now, she whispered to Robert, to the children, to Judith Hartford, to everyone who had suffered in that basement. Rest, you're free. Margot Sinclair died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 95. The obituary in the local paper mentioned her work as a child advocacy activist. It mentioned the Hartford basement case. It mentioned her dedication to honoring the memory of children who had suffered abuse. But what the obituary didn't mention was the more subtle legacy Margot left behind. She had changed the conversation around childhood trauma. She had helped pass new legislation protecting children. She had trained hundreds of social workers and investigators. She had established scholarships in the names of the children from the basement. She had written a memoir that had become required reading in psychology programs across the country. And in the community she had lived in for the last 20 years of her life, people remembered her differently than they might have remembered her if she had simply been a widow living quietly. They remembered her as a woman of strength and purpose, a woman who had taken a terrible tragedy and transformed it into something meaningful. The house at 42 Riverside still stands. It has been renovated again, updated for the modern era. But the memorial wall in the park has become a place of pilgrimage for people interested in the history of childhood protection in America. Visitors come from all over the country to read the names carved in stone, to remember, to mourn, to find inspiration. And sometimes on warm spring nights, people walking past the memorial report seeing something extraordinary. They report seeing children playing on the grass near the wall, children who seem to glow faintly in the darkness, children who smile and wave and then, when approached, vanish like morning mist. Whether these are real apparitions or simply the product of grief and imagination is unknowable. But people who have seen them invariably feel better afterward. They feel lighter. They feel as if they've been given a blessing or a sign that somewhere, somehow, justice has been served. And perhaps that's the truest legacy of Margot Sinclair. Perhaps it's knowing that the children who were lost, who were forgotten, who were trapped in darkness for over a century, perhaps they finally found their way into the light. Perhaps they finally found peace. Perhaps they finally found home. On quiet nights when the wind rustles through the trees, it's possible, if you listen carefully, to hear the sound of children laughing. Not in fear, not in pain, but in joy, in freedom, in the simple happiness of being alive and being remembered and finally being set free.